Thank you to the Africa Climate Action Initiative for giving me the privilege to participate in this official launch today. I hope that you are all keeping safe wherever you are in this challenging period. I want to talk about the impact of climate change on conflict in the Lake Chad region of West Africa. I'll be talking about an area where, even as Sarah pointed out in her presentation, that people here are dealing with COVID-19, which is compounding an already perilous situation. Communities in the Sahel region of West Africa have been impacted by conflicts that have arisen because of the competition for resources created, the situation that has been created by climate change. Today, as the world is tackling COVID-19, in Nigeria, one of the most impacted places is the city of Kano, which is in the Sahel. The numbers there are rising every day. The deaths are increasing every day. People do not have access to the right medical facilities. In Maiduguri, the largest city in the Lake Chad Basin, we have a situation where even before COVID-19, there were 3 million people that were already displaced because of conflicts that have been caused in part by climate change. In Maiduguri alone, in the Maiduguri area, there are over 1 million people that are living in IDP camps and in host communities, depending on aid for food, for medicine, and other supplies. Today, COVID-19 is spreading within the community, and we can only hope for the best because medical facilities are just not adequate. Now, let us go to the next slide. We see that climate change is causing conflicts over scarce resources. And I'm going to be speaking about the Boko Haram conflict in a short while. What many don't recognize, what many don't know, is that the Boko Haram conflict is caused in part by climate change. There were underlying conditions, ecological conditions, that created impoverishment and displacement even before the Boko Haram conflict. And it is because of these conditions that it made Boko Haram to emerge. Let us go to the next slide. Now, many consider conflict like the Boko Haram conflict as something that is happening far away in Africa. For those in North America, in Canada, what people don't recognize is that climate change and climate change impact have been created by the lifestyle of people in the global north. European and North American emissions have had impact on the Sahel region for a long time. Studies have shown that the droughts of the 1970s and 1980s have been caused by emissions of greenhouse gases and aerosols in North America and Europe. The release of aerosols in the Northern Hemisphere from the 1960s up to the 1980s resulted in atmospheric cooling there and the shifting of the tropical rain bands southwards, which caused severe droughts in the Sahel. And when this happened, countries needed to deal with this situation. Next slide. Because of the hunger, the hunger in the area from the 1970s and 1980s, international development agencies, including the World Bank, encouraged African countries to build large-scale irrigation projects, dams and irrigation projects. The impact of this project was that even the scarce land was taken away from farming communities to make way for irrigation projects. And irrigation projects spurred land grabbing among the political military elite to the exclusion of poor farmers. And many of those that were pushed away from their farmland to make way for the dams and irrigation projects ended up in the major cities, in the slums of the major cities. And some of the crises that we're seeing, the urban crisis, like the Boko Haram crisis in the Lake Chad Basin, have been caused by the children and the grandchildren of those that were displaced by the 1970s and 1980s dams and irrigation projects. Now, we also see that because of climate change, communities have traditionally moved their cattle to the south, from the Sahel region to the south, after harvest periods to feed on crops, residues, and to fertilize the land, are moving to the south more and more throughout the famine, even during the famine season, because of the ecological pressures created by climate change. And when pastoralists move and encounter farming communities, cattle sometimes destroy crops. And this reality creates anger and conflict between farming communities and pastoralists. And this conflict has resulted in wars in several communities all over West Africa. Nigeria is a very bad case where thousands of people have been killed, whole communities have been destroyed, people massacred because of those conflicts. In Mali, we are seeing similar situations in countries like Burkina Faso, even in Ghana, where there have been records of such conflicts. And the reality is that with climate change continuing, that if action is not taken to have proper adaptation measures, that this conflict will continue. Next slide, please. I've already talked about the dams and the development projects, which even from the 1980s started generating insurgencies. There were peasant uprisings in 1980 in Bakolori, in Kano, in Sokoto in Nigeria, the Masatini uprising in Kano, also in the 1980s, because of displacements that were caused by the building of huge dams and irrigation infrastructure. However, during the period, and even as we see with the Boko Haram insurgency right now, those uprisings were not explained as ecological crisis. The narrative that is dominant is that of religious conflict. So when such uprisings occur, it is, because most of the people that have led this uprising in the past have tended to be Islamic clerics, it is easy to label those uprisings as religious disturbances without having an understanding of the underlying conditions that created the impoverishment, the mass impoverishment that caused these uprisings in the first place. In the same way that we saw with the peasant revolts in 1980 in Bakolori, in Matasine, we are seeing the same situation in the Lake Chad Basin from the about 10 years ago. Next slide, please. So now, what has been the impact of climate change on the Lake Chad Basin? This is an area that is one of the most impacted in the world, that ongoing impact of climate change. Even as a Nigerian living in the South, we had no idea of the enormous impact of climate change in the Sahel area and in the Lake Chad region in particular. But what we have seen now is that from the 1960s to now, about 90% of the Lake Chad was lost. And the Lake Chad Basin used to be one of the most important freshwater sources, particularly in the semi-arid region. And the Lake Chad, the waters of the Lake Chad was used by fishermen from Chad, from Niger Republic, from Cameroon and Nigeria. And it is estimated that about 20 million people depended on their livelihoods from the Lake Chad Basin, either as fishers, either as traders, or even people that engage in agriculture, in the floodplains of the Lake Chad Basin. But now the Lake Chad is almost completely dried up, and that has had severe impacts on livelihood. It is the situation of unemployment, mass impoverishment in that area as a result of the ecological changes caused by climate change that created the conditions for the Boko Haram conflict. Because you have a lot of young men in particular who are disillusioned, who are frustrated because of lack of livelihood, because of lack of employment. And these people are easily recruited by Islamists, using the kind of ideology that they know to preach against the government. And what has happened, next slide please, is that the crisis, the Boko Haram crisis, the war and insurgency has resulted in the killing of over 20,000 people during the past 10 years, and the displacement of over 3 million people. In fact, in the Lake Chad Basin area, in the 4 countries, there are about 7 million people that are dependent on aid or need some form of assistance or the other for survival. And what we're having is that the COVID-19 situation is compounding an already bad situation. Next slide. Can we have the next slide? The next slide, please. If you go to Maiduguri, the areas around Maiduguri, just moving around the community, you see communities that have been completely destroyed. The entire Borno, particularly apart from Maiduguri's town, almost the whole of Borno state have been destroyed by by the Boko Haram insurgents. There are millions of children that are in danger of starvation, and because of climate change and conflicts related to climate change, and the COVID-19 situation compounds their situation. And what I have not mentioned enough is the impact on women. Everybody, you may have heard about the Chibok girls that have been abducted by the Boko Haram insurgents, the Dapchi girls. Beyond the Chibok girls, there are thousands of girls that have been adopted and forced into sex slavery, forced marriages. Women have been raped. Women have been widowed. Hundreds of thousands of women have been widowed because of the conflicts, and they're living in refugee camps under states of destitution. And we have a situation where there's an urgent need. To respond not only to the immediate humanitarian needs of the people, but the responses, we have to understand that while the people have immediate need for food, immediate need for medicine, immediate need for shelter, and it's also important to address the underlying ecological conditions that created the impoverishment and conflict in the area in the first place. And that is where climate change adaptation becomes key. Let us go to the next slide as we conclude. So what we're suggesting, and in the spirit of the Africa Climate Action Initiative, is the need to continue to build awareness, the need to promote solidarity and collaboration among people in Africa and the global north, solidarity that is based on a common understanding of the issues that we're confronted. We need to understand the need to support women during climate change adaptation. We need to understand the need to invest in alternative energy, to provide access to alternative energy for the most vulnerable people, and that will need different kinds of investments, small scale and larger scale investments. And we also need to address food security through ecological means that will be developed based on that informed by the participation and needs of the beneficiaries themselves. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this.